Okay, folks, I decided to kind of switch things up a little bit today and do an audio lecture or an audio slideshow lecture for a couple of reasons. One was just really to switch things up a little bit just for variety. And the other is that you'll be doing one of these as part of the major project you will embark on in the second part of the course. So one of the culminating pieces of work you'll do is to do a recorded slideshow presentation about your project. And so I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to start getting into that kind of modeling of that and whatnot. As we get closer to that, I'll certainly be offering possible ways to pull this off in a media sense in terms of what software you might consider and so forth. In case you want to jump out ahead of this, the general category of software for this is, if you want to Google it, would be screen recorder or screen recording software. So it allows you to record basically anything that's on your screen. And so if you're moving a cursor around or whatever, anything that appears on your screen will be recorded. And you set it up obviously so you can record your voice at the same time. And then you save that out as a movie file and then post it to YouTube. But that's giving you a little bit of advance, just to let you know, since we have a fairly short number of weeks here, this won't come up until pretty much the middle of the second to last week, and then into that area probably. I think we'll probably want to finish these in week 4 and then go into actually presenting them to each other. Sort of, we're going to use this as class content in the last week. So just keeping that in mind. So anyway, this morning's lecture, or today's lecture, is called Directions and Trajectories, Our Path or Course Thus Far. So we have basically been tracking a couple of essential questions. We packed our bags and started our journey with these two questions. What is new media, and what is new media doing to us? And as I noted in my last email to you guys, I think we're making really good progress on this. It is actually, these questions are deceptively simple, right? They're actually fairly complex questions, and that's good. So I think we're doing good work to kind of sort them out a little bit already. In just a few days we've been working on this. So the map, a kind of process map, is over here on the left. We have, we entered our course. We started our course by entering the sort of Planet McLuhan, and then we branched off into sort of visiting Planet Baudrillard and Planet Lacan, and then at the end of the week we met back again. We sort of converged around the work of Wengao Huang and Bruce Maslish, and then moving on, we're going to be sort of taking everything we've gathered here and rolling it forward into additional readings and additional theorists that I think will add dimensions to the understanding we built in the first week. So that's the kind of map of the territory, so to speak, or a process map. So again, we started with McLuhan's balanced, holistic, non-dualistic, and also quite simple account of what new media is and what it's doing to us. So in saying that new media is an extension of the human nervous system, I think he essentially is saying that new media is an externalized amplification system for all things human. So I think that this is actually a definition of new media that would probably fly pretty well across Baudrillard and Lacan and the other people we're looking at also. That's basically, it amplifies everything. So, and I think sure enough, I think it's safe to say we've all seen the amplification of, in the wake of new media, we've seen the amplification of information and perspectives, pettiness and porn, the fascination with representations, the kind of corrective returnings to the body and nature, empathy and concern for others, people we may not have been aware of before, we're now like in contact with or seeing images of, and that kind of thing. And also the sort of the increase or amplification in opinionatedness as well as in understanding. And so again, I think you can make the case that we just are looking at an amplification of basically all things human. and that a definition built in there is that new media is an amplification system. So we might say that the volume on all things human has simply been turned up, or perhaps to kind of use a musical analogy, a different one or more specific one. We've all kind of plugged in. So I connect to this, for example, in terms of if I like to work with wood, and so I could imagine being a kind of purist, right, and using only hand tools. But there might be a day when I would, I would move into the use of power tools, or again, with the guitarist, there might be that fateful day when you plug in, right? So that kind of idea that arguably human nature has simply been sort of plugged in, or that option to plug in has been put before us. So in the process of plugging in partially, fully, or some people might try to limit it as much as possible, and even any way you slice it, in the process of adopting and using new media, we have flooded our world with the logic of the nervous system. Again, this would be McLuhan's basic insight, which is to say that we have flooded the world with a logic of connectivity. So arguably, among the things getting better connected or integrated as a result are the two hemispheres of the brain, those kind of connections. The connections between science and art, for example. So there are lots of connections being made that maybe were also makeable before, but now have become almost unavoidable. So in this framework of, again, everything being, connections being amplified, etc., that I would think no connections are more fundamental to all things human than the new connectivity between brain hemispheres and the new connectivity between brain or mind and body or viscera, and the new relationship all of us have to science through interacting with new media. So this is a kind of theme we kind of obviously get a full view of in the Huang article of the importance of contemporary science. And again, I think I've mentioned in one of my emails, it's easy to miss that new media is a kind of branch of science, right? And so we are all kind of ritualistically becoming more scientific as we move on. And we'll see this in this class too, some of the issues that we will come up against, like, what's going on with multitasking, et cetera, these are not resolvable through any path really other than science, in terms of, the details of it, whether it's indeed good, bad, indifferent, whatever. These are topics that increasingly require science to come up with an understanding about them. So there are these kind of connections, again, hemispheres, brain hemispheres. That research started back in the 70s. It's been updated. It's not the same as it was then, but it's still a live wire. Again, connectivity between brain and body, mind and body, and new relationship to science. I think these are key ones because they all connect and intersect through this zone of new media. So, and our friend McLuhan speaks eloquently about the simple secret to the puzzle of his work being that he simply figured out how to integrate the right hemisphere into his thinking and living, while many others had not. And so it's again stunningly simple, but tends to be not easy to do. It's not easy for us to imagine this, let alone do it. So I'm going to play this clip. This is just a tiny, very short clip where he says this in response to an interviewer. I can get this to play here.
Forgive my impertinence, but has anybody asked you why you are sometimes difficult to understand?
Because I use the right hemisphere when they're trying to use the left hemisphere.
Okay, well,
simple.
I'll try and get back on the left.
You see, that when the people ordinarily people are trained to try to follow you and to connect everything you say with what they last heard, they're not prepared to use their wits. They're only prepared to use the idea they picked up the first time and try to connect it to another idea.
Okay, so that's another sort of statement from McLuhan directly about brain hemispheres and about how he is sort of, integrating this right brain functionality into his thinking, and that's simple secret of what makes him somewhat difficult to understand, but also incredibly insightful, I think, in describing the things he does. So this was our first theorist to take on, was Marshall McLuhan. And again, hopefully you have had your appetites whet for McLuhan's work. Obviously, there's not much we can do in a course of 5 weeks to really delve deeply into any of these people. But McLuhan is a person that's worthy to take on as a kind of traveling companion, in terms of maybe just sort of gradually, bit by bit, sort of exploring around the territory he has explored. So we might say that McLuhan's work is one example of the power that gets unleashed when both hemispheres are amplified and interconnected. So in this sense, he is a product of the new media that he so well analyzed and articulated and also synthesized. So in this sense, he realizes a kind of balance, a kind of holism and a non-dualism. So by that I mean he's balancing the brain hemispheres. He gets the buzz of new media, but doesn't go overboard with it, right? So he realizes there needs to be balance, and it's in that realization that becomes a holist or a non-dualist. So we might say that instead of being trapped in a vortex, McLuhan got caught up in a swirl, a sort of positive image of a kind of development. All right, so moving on. So Baudrillard arguably provides us with a dystopic example of what happens. So he doesn't get caught up in a swirl. He sort of more like gets sort of like sucked into a vortex, the one he calls hyperreality. When that is arguably when the human urge to represent is amplified without a corrective. In other words, without a balancing point or without a counterbalance. So, for example, the experience of hearing amplified feedback through a sound system, we all know what that's like, I'm sure. That arguably is what Baudrillard describes, right? So it's a sort of imbalance, though, I think, related to just focusing on the amplification of the impulse to represent. Now, whether I'm sure Baudrillard is writing sincerely, or if he's writing in a way to make a point about the craziness that's out there, or the craziness that can happen when folks are unable to deal with the onslaught of the hyperreal, that is up for debate. Again, Baudrillard's a person that you could search online for. You could actually listen to lectures he's made and whatnot. And he knows what he's talking about. He's a very intelligent guy, and so it is really possible that he created the piece that we wrote kind of as an object lesson or an example of what he's talking about. So, but either way, whether he was writing sincerely or writing in a way to make a point about craziness that existed elsewhere, we could say that he provided us with a kind of cautionary tale or a picture of imbalance or compartmentalism or dualism, when the sort of image side of human nature is totally separate in a dualistic way from the embodied side of human nature. So we'll put Baudrillard there in red, right? So a possible like stop sign or warning sign of what can happen in certain kind of conditions of amplification. On the other side, Lacan provides us with a focus on a corrective, sort of a return to balance, back to the body, back to nature and physical reality. So in some ways, we use Lacan for this purpose to kind of call attention to this other dimension, which Lacan's work arguably does, and that is the dimension of human nature as embodied fact, right, and very physical reality. So very different from and contrasted to the idea of just spinning endlessly in one interpretation after another and that sort of thing. So it's a very different focus, and I think it's a very useful one because, as I think I've mentioned in other places, Lacan adds this dimension of physicality that, whereas McLuhan is balanced in this way too. He gets that there needs to be a counterbalance. He tends to focus on insight rather than physicality, and that to some extent creates some less successful corrective. So this was kind of like our path or course, kind of started with McLuhan, diverged into Planet Baudrillard and Planet Lacan, and then on into a kind of reintegrated world of described by Huang and Maslish. So they more or less put us back together again, back to embodied thinking, mindful embodiment, these kind of combinations or relational wholes, balance, holism, non-dualism. These are all things that we could associate with the kind of work that Huang and Maslish both made us aware of. So in terms of looking at the course of our course thus far, so we start with a kind of holistic vision here with McLuhan, breaks up a little bit to focus to look at what dualism looks like, more or less, and then back to a kind of emphatically or explicitly non-dualistic statement about reality and about new media's role in it. So it's not just sort of left in a dualistic place. It comes back together, and then we're moving forward here again into articulating further details of that kind of non-dualism. So from here we're going to add dimensions to the non-dualism by looking at the intersection of new media and science, brain hemisphere research, and seeing what comes out of that. And it will definitely generate additional answers to our questions about new media, about what new media is and what it's doing to us. But at this point, all of these answers will be kind of key to maintaining the balance, holism, and non-dualism of, again, McLuhan at the front end, and then Huang and Maslish towards the end of this kind of particular part of our journey. So that's where we're headed. So, and just to kind of demystify things a bit, non-dualism, it doesn't have to be really, a lofty sort of abstract thing. It just simply means dialogic, relational, inclusive, both and thinking. Not either or thinking. And this either or part is that which Huang, I think, does a good job of describing, has been and continues to be sort of the prescribed Western way in many instances. So the object of study, to look at non-dualism in a specific sense, the object of study is not technology specifically or human nature specifically, but rather the relationship between technology and human nature. So it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about things. And we are typically not taught to think that way. And some say that our language structures don't support it either, except when it comes to contemporary science. And so this is where the intersection with science gets really meaningful, is that science is itself non-dualistic, right? It's very involved in the physical world and also very involved in the conceptual world. One foot in each aspect of humanity, so to speak. And so the language that's being generated around contemporary science is very helpful to us. And again, the connection with new media is that new media is basically a branch of contemporary science, right? That's where it came from. So that's where we're going to turn our focus this week, to those areas mentioned before that have traction in contemporary science. So the specific areas we're going to focus on will again be the brain and brain hemispheres. We're going to kind of track that research from its beginnings, more or less, to more current statements of it. The notion of embodied cognition is really an interesting one. So, lots of times we talk about the brain, and then we talk more about the brain and more about the brain, and we forget that the central nervous system runs throughout the body, obviously, and some people, will make the case, and these are, neuroscience people, will make the case that there's a brain the size of a cat's brain in our gut, right? And so we'll listen to a presentation, a TED Talk by a person talking about this. So embodied cognition is a very interesting strand of research that wants to take the idea of intelligence away from the idea of being totally confined to thinking about the brain. And then we'll look at another example of coevolution. There's a really fun PBS Nova show on called Dogs Decoded that gives another picture of this sort of idea of coevolution, which again is a kind of holistic way of seeing things, that humans didn't sort of evolve in isolation. And so there's in some instances, like in the case of dogs, there is a live possibility that we co-evolved socially in a way, not in a physical way, but co-evolved with canines for much of our history. And so that'll be kind of some areas that we'll look at. And as we move forward, I think we'll continue to make connections and continue to add to our definition of what new media is. And then obviously we're going to transition somewhere at the end of this coming week into focusing on what it's doing to us in terms of what issues you guys would like to explore for your own projects. And so we'll be talking more about that later, but I do want to keep reminding you that that's coming up in case you want to start parking your good ideas or areas of interest, making note of them so that you can frame up something relatively easily when it comes to where you'd like to do some research and reportage on a particular issue in the intersection of new media and human nature and things like that. So there we go. That's today's talk, and we're moving at a clip, and I hope you guys are enjoying it.